Long before any single human being was born, the situations they would face in life had already been faced, by every ancestor stretching back to the earliest humans. Birth, death, the encounter with a powerful parent, the quest into unknown territory, the discovery of a hidden enemy, the meeting with a wise guide. These experiences are so fundamental, so inescapable, that over the vast span of human evolution they left their mark not just on cultures and religions but on the structure of the mind itself. Carl Jung called those marks archetypes, and he believed they were among the most powerful forces shaping human psychology. An archetype is not an image. This is the most common misunderstanding about Jung's concept. The archetype itself is invisible. It is a predisposition, a structural tendency in the collective unconscious, a kind of psychic mold waiting to be filled. What we actually encounter, in dreams, myths, art, religious visions, and spontaneous fantasy, are archetypal images, the specific forms the archetype takes when it manifests in consciousness. The archetype of the Great Mother, for instance, is the underlying psychic pattern. Isis, Mary, Kali, Demeter, and the fairy godmother are all archetypal images, culturally specific expressions of the same underlying structure. Jung identified a number of major archetypes through his clinical work and his comparative study of world mythology and religion. The hero is perhaps the most universally recognized, the figure who leaves the familiar world, faces trials and monsters, and returns transformed. Every culture on Earth has its version of this story because the hero maps onto a universal psychological process, the confrontation with unconscious forces in the service of growth and individuation. The shadow, which we have explored separately, is the archetype of the dark side, the repository of what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The Great Mother is a dual archetype encompassing both the nurturing, life-giving dimension of the feminine and its devouring, terrifying aspect. The wise old man is the archetype of meaning and guidance, the inner voice of accumulated wisdom that sometimes appears in dreams as a sage, a mentor, or a mysterious stranger. The anima and animus represent the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, the feminine in the man, the masculine in the woman. The trickster is the archetype of disruption and paradox, the figure who subverts order, breaks rules, and in doing so often opens pathways to new understanding. And the self, which Jung considered the central archetype of all, represents the totality of the psyche and the goal of psychological development. One reason archetypes carry such enormous psychological power is precisely because they operate largely outside conscious control. When an archetype is activated, by a life event, a dream, a piece of art, or a relationship, it brings with it an emotional charge that can feel overwhelming. Falling in love activates the anima or animus archetype. Encountering a mentor activates the wise old man facing a major life transition activates the hero archetype. These are not merely metaphors. For Jung, they described real psychic events, moments when the deep grammar of the collective unconscious rises into conscious experience and demands to be integrated. Archetypes also explain one of the most puzzling features of human cultural life, the astonishing consistency of mythological and religious themes across completely isolated civilizations. The flood myth appears in dozens of unconnected cultures. The dying and rising god is found from Egypt to Mexico to ancient Scandinavia. The dragon-slaying hero appears across Eurasia, the Americas, and sub-Saharan Africa. For Jung, this was not coincidence or diffusion. It was evidence that these stories emerge from a shared psychic substrate, from the collective unconscious and its archetypal patterns. Understanding archetypes has practical value that goes well beyond academic interest. When you recognize that the intensity of a particular emotional reaction or relationship dynamic has an archetypal dimension, when you notice that you are living out a pattern that is older and larger than your individual history, something shifts. You gain perspective. The pattern no longer has you entirely. You begin to have it. You become capable of engaging consciously with forces that previously ran your life from the shadows. Jung was careful to warn, however, against what he called inflation, the danger of identifying with an archetype rather than simply being influenced by it. The person who believes they are the hero, rather than someone temporarily in a heroic situation, has been seized by the archetype rather than illuminated by it. The goal is always consciousness, not to be swallowed by the archetypal pattern, but to engage with it wisely. Subscribe to Psychology Theories Explained to explore more of the ideas that shape the modern mind.